The sky was already burning when he arrived, split open by a red that didn't belong to sunset or storm. It was the wrong shade for nature and the right shade for omen. In the widening silence between thunderclaps, between the heartbeat of a city and the moment it realizes it is about to be hunted, something ancient crossed a boundary it was never meant to touch. Not a hero, not a god, something that laughed at both titles and bled between them. And far below, in streets carved from steel and glass, the world tilted just enough for monsters and legends to finally collide. If you feel the pull of this kind of story, if you want to keep walking into the dark with me where absurdity meets apocalypse and immortality brushes against virtue, then stay with this tale. Share it with a friend who loves impossible crossovers, and bind yourself to this channel so you don't miss what waits beyond the next shadow. The sky rejected him. That was Alucard's first coherent thought as he fell through it, not tore through it, not descended, but fell, as if whatever gate he had forced open had decided petulantly to drop him like a discarded bullet casing. The air screamed on the way down, thinner and cleaner than any battlefield he remembered, carrying none of the familiar rot of cordite or old blood. It tasted young, untested, wrong. Clouds split around him in frantic white shreds as gravity reasserted itself with offended certainty, and somewhere below, a city drew a sharp, metallic breath. He hit the rooftop with a sound like a dropped cathedral bell. Concrete spiderweb beneath him, caving inward in a shallow crater that steamed from the heat his arrival had dragged through the atmosphere. For a moment, there was only settling dust and the distant wail of alarms beginning to rise like nervous insects. Alucard lay still at the center of it, coat smoldering at the hem, hat miraculously intact. The city's lights smeared across his crimson lenses in fractured gold and white, unfamiliar constellations mapped onto glass and steel. "Well," he murmured at last, voice amused, echoing lazily off surrounding structures. "This is new." He rose in a smooth, boneless motion, boots crunching on broken aggregate. The rooftop was crowned with vents, satellite dishes, and the low electrical hum of infrastructure that felt more alive than it should have. The air carried ozone and rain, and something else beneath it, hope perhaps, or its more nervous cousin. He rolled one shoulder, feeling the world's resistance where a different version of physics pressed back against him, as if reality here had sharper elbows. No welcoming committee, no holy wards burning his skin, no familiar scent of vampire or ghoul or anything that pretended to eternity the way he did. Just a city sprawling in arrogant defiance of the horizon, spires and bridges stitched together with threads of light. Somewhere far below, people were looking up. His grin widened. He stepped to the edge and leaned out, coat-tails whispering in the wind. The drop was obscene. Streets tens of stories down boiled with motion, vehicles streaming like veins of light, pedestrians scattering in erratic clusters as shock rippled outward from the impact. Sirens multiplied, harmonizing into an urgent, rising chord. He could feel their eyes before he saw them, tiny, fragile attention snagging on the impossible figure silhouetted against floodlit clouds. Fear always arrived first. It was polite like that. Alucard inhaled, slow and indulgent, drawing the city's panic into his lungs. It wasn't the sharp terror of hunted prey, not yet, but the communal unease of something undefined, something that hadn't settled into a narrative people could survive. A meteor, a bomb, a new kind of aircraft failure. They needed a name for it, and until they found one, dread would sit in the gap like a held breath. Far below, a woman tripped and fell in her scramble to run, palms scraping raw on the pavement. A man skidded to a stop to help her, eyes never leaving the sky. Somewhere, a child was laughing because children laughed at things that terrified adults. Alucard watched all of it with a detached, anthropological fascination. This world had not yet learned how to be afraid of him. It was still guessing. That, he decided, was adorable. He stepped off the rooftop. The fall was a long, luxurious thing. Wind tore at his coat and laughter tore from his throat as the ground rushed up with sudden urgency. At the last moment, he twisted, boots hitting the side of the building, and using it like a staircase. 1, 2, 3 thunderous impacts before he kicked away and dropped the rest of the distance in a single, bone-rattling crash that pulverized a parked car beneath him. Glass burst outward in a crystalline howl. Alarms shrieked their outrage. When the dust thinned, he was already standing. The street had frozen around him. Vehicles lay skewed at panicked angles, drivers half out of doors, frozen between flight and disbelief. A ring of people held at a cautious distance, phones lifted in trembling hands, mouths open in shapes that hadn't yet learned how to speak the moment. Alucard tipped his hat to them with mock courtliness. "Evening," he said. Someone screamed. The sound cracked the spell. Panic tore loose in earnest, people surging back, colliding, shouting warnings that trampled each other into nonsense. Alucard let the energy wash over him, eyes tracking the nearest pulse of steady defiance. A security guard at the mouth of an underground garage, weapon raised with hands that shook just enough to be honest. The man fired. The bullet crossed the distance in a heartbeat. Alucard's head snapped back, hat sailing from his grasp as the round punched cleanly through one crimson lens and out the other side in a spray of dark. His body folded backward, boneless, hitting the pavement with theatrical finality. For one perfect, suspended second, hope dared to exist. Then the body unraveled. Shadow boiled where flesh had been, tendrils of darkness pulling the scattered pieces back together with obscene tenderness. A ruined skull reknit itself, bone knitting from nothing, blood flowing backward into veins that remembered its shape. Alucard rose again, whole, hat drifting down to land neatly back atop his head. He clapped once, slow and deliberate. "See," he called to the guard whose face had gone ashen, eyes locked on a miracle his prayers had no room for. "Now that's just rude. You didn't even ask my name." The guard dropped the gun and ran. Alucard watched him go, interest already fatting. The city had given him his first wordless answer, and it was consistent with every other world he had visited. They would always try with guns first. It was comforting in a way. High above, beyond the reach of sirens and screaming civilians, something else had noticed him. Not fear, not curiosity, watchfulness. The kind that didn't flinch when monsters laughed. Alucard tilted his head, as if sensing a gaze pressing back against his own through layers of steel and stone. His grin sharpened. "Oh," he murmured, "you're going to be fun." The city surged on around him, unaware that its first true guardian had just fixed its attention on a red-eyed thing in a shattered street, and that an older predator had finally sensed something in this world that might survive a conversation. High above the street where panic still frothed and scattered, a figure stood motionless on the edge of a gargoyle-lined rooftop, cape stirring in the cold wind like a patient shadow. The distance between them was measured not in meters but in intent. Alucard could feel it now with a predator's sixth sense, a pressure against the back of his awareness like a held breath that refused to exhale. This was not the static attention of cameras or the jittery focus of law enforcement. This was deliberate, disciplined, ancient in its own, quieter way. He lifted his gaze slowly, eyes cutting through layers of architecture and night until they found the rooftop silhouette framed against drifting cloud. For a heartbeat, the city between them felt like a shared thought. Then the wind shifted, and the moment stretched thin without breaking. "Well now," Alucard said softly to the empty air, as if the night itself were the intended audience. "You're not in uniform, that's already refreshing." Below him, the crowd broke further apart as heavier emergency vehicles forced their way through stalled traffic. Armed officers spilled out, voices sharp and overlapping, the choreography of containment attempting to assemble around something that refused to be contained. Spotlights flared, bleaching the street in harsh white. Every beam found him at once. Alucard spread his arms slightly, coat opening like dark wings. He gave them the courtesy of a full, theatrical bow. The first volley of gunfire tore into him, less as an attack and more as a confession of fear made audible. Bullets chewed through fabric, through muscle, through bone, each impact punctuated by wet, stuttering ruptures that would have pulped anything else. He staggered back a step, then another, body perforated, head snapping sideways under a cluster of impacts that shredded half his face into red vapor. Then he stood still. The damage reversed in a language the human eye was not built to follow. Flesh flowed like rewound film. Bone reasserted its geometry with obscene confidence. Holes closed with quiet finality. When the last fragment of lead clattered to the pavement at his feet, Alucard was whole again, smile undimmed. Silence followed, vast and stunned. "You know," he said conversationally, brushing a phantom speck of dust from his sleeve, "where I come from, that considered flirting." One officer fired again out of sheer reflex. The round flattened against Alucard's forehead and dropped harmlessly to the ground. From above, the watching figure moved. There was no rush of air, no dramatic plunge. One moment the gargoyle rooftop was occupied, the next it was not. A blur crossed the vertical distance between skyline and street with predatory grace, cape snapping once in the wind before settling like a living thing around armored shoulders. The impact was controlled, surgical, boots kissing asphalt without a crack. The nearest officers recoiled automatically, years of training snapping into place, weapons lowering a fraction in visceral recognition of something that rewrote the hierarchy of the moment. Alucard's grin widened as he regarded the newcomer from beneath the brim of his hat. Black armor absorbed the light instead of reflecting it. The symbol on the chest was not an emblem of state or faith, but of warning. White islets regarded him without visible emotion. Alucard tilted his head. "Oh, this is precious," he said. "A bat." The silence from the armored figure was not empty. It was weighted, deliberate. The kind of quiet that pressed information into the air without speaking it. When the voice finally came, it was low, controlled, stripped of unnecessary sound. "You don't belong here." Alucard laughed, a rich, delighted sound that rippled through the stunned space between them. "Oh, my dear nocturnal friend, you have no idea how often I hear that." The bat did not move, not an inch of wasted motion. The officers watched the two figures facing one another as if reality itself were holding its breath. Alucard felt it then, a strange friction against his presence, not a holy ward, not a spell, but something stubborn and human layered thick with will. It didn't burn him, it resisted him. "How charming," he murmured, "you're not afraid." "Fear is irrelevant," the bat replied. "You're a threat." Alucard's eyes flicked briefly to the terrified civilians still cowering at the edges of the street, to the overturned car crumpled beneath his earlier landing, to the blood that had already soaked into the cracks of this world's pavement. His blood, briefly borrowed back by gravity. He returned his attention to the armored sentinel. "Technically," he said lightly, "I haven't actually killed anyone yet. That's restraint. You should see me when I'm being impolite." The bat's cape shifted almost imperceptibly as his stance adjusted, calculating, measuring, preparing. Alucard could feel the coiled violence in the man like a drawn bowstring, not supernatural, something rarer in certain ways. The first strike came without warning. A grappling line snapped outward, wrapping around Alucard's torso with armored precision, and yanking him forward with enough force to tear a lesser being off its feet. Alucard allowed himself to be pulled a single step before his boots fused to the asphalt with a screech of protest. He glanced down at the cable cinched around his chest with open curiosity. "You're going to want something sturdier than that," he advised. The bat surged forward in a blur fist, driving into Alucard's sternum with the full weight of momentum and reinforced gauntlet. The impact cratered the asphalt beneath Alucard's feet and hurled him backward through the front of a storefront in a deafening explosion of glass and pulverized steel. Inside the darkened ruin of the shop, dust and hanging wires swayed in the sudden quiet. Alucard lay amid shattered display cases and torn shelving, hat resting absurdly intact atop a mound of debris. For a moment, he did not move. Above the ruined entrance, the bat stood framed by flickering emergency lights, posture taut, prepared for the inevitable. Slowly, delighted applause echoed from within the wreckage. "Now that," Alucard said as he rose, coat reforming itself around torn edges of flesh, "was a proper greeting." Outside, the city leaned closer without realizing it. On rooftops and in shadowed alleys, other eyes began to turn, other calculations began to unfold. The night had not only acquired a monster, it had found a question it could not immediately answer. And somewhere deep beneath Gotham's stone and bone, mechanisms of contingency and ancient vigilance quietly awakened. The shop was still breathing dust when the first ripple of motion touched the shadows. Glass crunched under Alucard's boots as he stepped forward through the ruined storefront, red eyes glowing faintly behind fractured reflections. Outside, emergency lights painted the street in alternating wounds of blue and red. The bat still stood where he had landed, silent now, unmoving, as if the entire city were a held trigger beneath his feet. Alucard rolled his shoulders once, vertebrae clicking back into perfect alignment with a sound like distant cutlery. "You hit harder than you look," he admitted with theatrical sincerity. "I adore efficiency." The bat did not answer with words this time. He answered with acceleration. The distance between them collapsed violently. A blur, a thundercrack of displaced air, then impact. Fist met jaw with bone-breaking intent. Alucard's head snapped sideways, hat spinning free at last and sailing end over end into the street before being crushed beneath a panicked tire. His body followed a fraction of a second later, horizontal, annihilating the remains of a newsstand in an avalanche of bent steel. Before the debris could settle, the bat was on him, knee driving down, pinning torso to shattered pavement. The street groaned beneath the concentrated force. Alucard laughed beneath the pressure, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "Oh, you're exciting," he said. "Most people stop trying by now." The bat's gauntlet flared with a controlled burst of energy, point blank. The concussive charge tore directly through Alucard's chest in a blast of smoke, fire, and arterial mist that painted the street in violent punctuation. The body went limp beneath him. For half a heartbeat, the bat allowed the possibility. Then the shadow beneath his knee moved. Darkness peeled upward like liquid midnight, swallowing shattered flesh and rethreading it with obscene patience. Ribs regrew with wet clicks. A heart reassembled itself around nothing and began to beat again. Alucard's eyes opened beneath the bat's grip, pupils alight with delighted intimacy. "Still not enough," he whispered. The bat disengaged instantly, backflipping away as tendrils of shadow lashed upward where his weight had been. They snapped through empty air instead, shredding bits of lamppost and signage with casual violence. Alucard rose once more, body knitting together as if death were an inconvenience he resented dismissing. Around them, the perimeter had finally broken. Police lines were collapsing under the psychic pressure of witnessing the impossible. Some fled, some froze, some raised weapons with hands so unsteady they might as well have been praying instead of aiming. From above, more watchers gathered. Alucard felt them like a changing pressure system in the atmosphere. The sky was no longer empty. Tiny movements strobed across distant rooftops. A whisper of displaced air marked a fast-moving shape circling high overhead. Somewhere far beyond sight, something ancient and still adjusted its attention with the patience of mountains. The bat shifted his stance, recalibrating not just to Alucard but to the expanding geometry of threat. The city was no longer a backdrop. It was becoming terrain. "You heal too fast," he said. "You don't bleed like a living organism." Alucard inspected the fresh hole in his chest as it closed, fingertips brushing over skin still warm from reconstruction. "Technically," he replied, "neither do you at this hour. The streets don't usually spawn armored mammals as part of the natural ecosystem." The bat lunged again. This time Alucard moved first. He vanished. Not invisibility, displacement. The space he had occupied collapsed into a smear of shadow as he reappeared behind the bat in a vertical eruption of dark mass. His hand pierced through armor plating and into something solid beneath, stopping a breath short of lethal intention on a whim. He leaned in, lips near the bat's ear, voice velvet and lethal. I could end this conversation very abruptly. The bat did not freeze. An elbow detonated backward into Alucard's ribs at point-blank range, the force amplified by hidden servos. Bones shattered outward through skin in a grotesque bloom. Alucard staggered, grip loosening. The bat tore free, twisting mid-motion, launching a spread of explosive pellets that detonated against Alucard's chest in a cascade of controlled, directional blasts. The street vanished inside sound and light. When the smoke cleared, a crater yawned where Alucard had stood. At its center, a scorched silhouette began to rise. Skin regrew in sheets. Muscle braided itself whole. Alucard emerged from the damage, laughing openly now, laughter echoing off ruined facades and trembling windows. Yes, he said, eyes burning brighter. That's the spirit. Now you're flirting properly. The bat did not answer, because at that moment, the night itself answered for him. A spear of green energy split the sky, slicing down between them with surgical precision. The blast punched into the asphalt, vaporizing a swath of street and carving a glowing scar that hissed with residual power. Heat rolled outward in a silent shockwave that forced both combatants to shift back on instinct. When the glare softened, a hovering figure hung above the wreckage, wrapped in emerald light, eyes fixed not with curiosity but with judgment. Alucard stared up at the newcomer with visible delight. "Oh," he said softly, "now the party becoming divine." The bat did not look away from Alucard, but his posture changed, subtly, meaningfully. A signal had been answered. The city was no longer testing the intruder alone. High overhead, beyond the circling green glow, something even faster tore across the clouds. The air cracked with displaced thunder. Somewhere far away, a woman watched from the edge of perception with a wariness born of gods. Alucard spread his arms slightly once more, coat whispering with unseen motion. His grin widened until it bordered on reverence. "Now this," he said to the gathering sky, "is what I call hospitality." And every instinct in Gotham, mortal and otherwise, finally began to scream that something truly wrong had fallen into their world and was enjoying itself. The emerald light pulsed once, twice, as the hovering figure descended a fraction lower. Boots never quite touching the air, it bent into obedience beneath him. The green glow wrapped his form like a living judgment, painting the shattered street in ghostlight and turning every drifting shard of glass into a floating star. Alucard studied him with open fascination, head tilted back, red eyes reflecting that alien brightness like garnets held to flame. "You arrived with fireworks," Alucard said, almost approvingly. "Do you always announce yourself like an execution?" "I announce myself where I'm needed," the figure replied, voice calm, resonant, layered with a quiet power that felt less like sound and more like law. "And right now, you are the emergency." Alucard's grin softened into something thoughtful. "Emergency," he repeated, tasting the word. "That implies I end. I assure you I'm more ongoing." The bat moved laterally without warning, repositioning with blinding speed, triangulating the space between Alucard and the hovering sentinel. The air itself seemed to tighten with intent, as the three figures formed an unstable geometry of threat and restraint. The green-lit guardian raised one glowing hand. Energy thickened around it, not explosive yet, but poised. "You regenerate, you adapt, you ignore trauma that would shatter most life, but you are not infinite." Alucard's eyes gleamed. "Oh, and you are speaking from experience. For more beings than you'd care to count." Something rippled through the upper atmosphere. Alucard felt it before it manifested. A sudden distortion in pressure, a tightening in the world's skin as if reality had flinched. His gaze snapped upward just as the clouds above parted violently, not with light, but with force. A shape punched through vapor at impossible speed and slammed into the street between them with a concussive boom that folded metal, pavement, and sound into a single stunned heartbeat. The shockwave hurled abandoned cars end over end. Windows detonated outward for blocks. The bat anchored himself with a grappling line in a blur of motion. The emerald figure was driven backward in a controlled skid through the air, stabilizing only at the very edge of the blast radius. At the center of the impact, the crater was deeper, cleaner. A figure straightened from it slowly, dust spilling off broad shoulders like falling snow. Blue and red cut through gray. A crest of gold caught the emergency lights, blazing. Those eyes, when they turned toward Alucard, did not carry fear or curiosity. They carried assessment. The street was silent, in a way it had not been all night. Alucard stared, then he laughed. Not with mockery this time, with something dangerously close to delight. "Oh," he breathed, "you're the sun." The man in blue did not answer immediately. His gaze moved from the mangled battlefield to the wounded civilians still frozen at the perimeter, to the hovering emerald sentinel, to the bat in the shadows. Finally, it returned to Alucard. "You're hurting people," he said. Alucard glanced around as if only just noticing the wreckage. Indirectly, mostly emotionally, the physical damage is more of a conversational side effect. In the space of a single breath, the man in blue blurred forward. The sound that followed was not an impact, it was a statement. Alucard was driven straight backward through 3 consecutive buildings, each one collapsing inward as if punched by a god's fist. The final structure gave way in a chain of cascading failure, vanishing into its own dust cloud as Alucard's body carved a smoking tunnel through concrete, steel, and rebar. When the dust finally settled, a vast, ringing silence overtook the block. The emerald sentinel hovered tensely above the devastation. The bat stood rigid on a shattered ledge, cape snapping in the backwash of settling air. The man in blue hovered just above street level now, eyes locked on the ruin he had created. Seconds passed. Then laughter echoed from inside the collapsed building. Stones shifted. Twisted girders peeled outward. The rubble began to move from within as if something beneath it were standing up while wearing a city as a coat. A dark shape surged upward through the wreckage, shedding debris in crushing avalanches. Alucard emerged, half his body still reconstructing, rib cage visible through reforming muscle, one arm regrowing in rippling strands of shadow and tissue. His hat was gone. His grin was not. That, he said, voice echoing through the broken street, was sufficient foreplay. He moved. For the first time since his arrival, Alucard did not toy with distance. The space between him and the man in blue vanished in a distortion of shadow and displaced force. His strike landed squarely against an invulnerable jaw with enough power to liquefy high-speed steel. It did not move the man in blue. The counterstrike launched Alucard vertically, a comet of blood and darkness hurled into the low cloud ceiling. He punched through storm vapor and disappeared from sight in less than a second. The man in blue followed. The sky boomed with successive thunderclaps as their exchange tore upward at impossible velocity. Shockwaves cascaded downward in expanding rings, rattling what remained of the street below. The Emerald Sentinel rose, guarding the civilians with layered force fields. The bat watched the sky, tracking movement at speeds no ordinary eye could resolve. High above, lightning and shadow twisted together in violent spirals. Alucard struck first again, descending from the clouds like a screaming meteor, both hands locked together in an overhead blow meant to crack continents. The man in blue caught it mid-descent. The impact stalled the fall in midair. For a brief, impossible moment, the two hovered locked together against gravity, red eyes burning into steady blue. Alucard's regeneration screamed under the pressure of hands that did not tear flesh but tested it, truly tested it. "You won't break me," Alucard said softly. The man in blue's reply was not loud. "You don't scare me." They vanished upward again, in a spiraling blur that tore a column through the clouds. Below, Gotham exhaled in shaking fragments. The crowd had long since scattered, but the city itself remained as if braced for impact, lights flickering, structures groaning under stresses their architects had never dreamed of. The Emerald Sentinel lowered slowly toward the street, eyes never leaving the heavens. "This is escalating," he said quietly. The bat's jaw tightened. That was inevitable. Far above, the sky churned with violence that rewrote scale and certainty. And somewhere within that storm of impacts and shadow, Alucard realized something he had not felt in centuries. Resistance that did not yield. Not yet. The clouds shredded around them in widening gyres as they traded momentum faster than thunder could finish forming its own echo. Each collision bent pressure into visible shockwaves, rippling the vapor into vast trembling rings. Alucard struck with centuries of battlefield instinct compressed into savage elegance. Every blow weighted with obscene force and the confidence of a body that could be ruined without consequence. The man in blue absorbed it all without yielding an inch of the sky. For the first time since tearing his way into this universe, Alucard felt something that was not pain, not pleasure, but measurement. He twisted mid-spin and drove his knee into his opponent's ribcage with enough power to flatten an armored column. The impact boomed like a cannon report and sent both of them spiraling apart through the storm. Alucard recovered first, shadows snapping him upright in midair. He lunged again, fingers clawing for the throat with predatory devotion. The grip closed. On steel. Not metaphor, not resistance, steel. Alucard's eyes flared as his hand locked around a neck that did not give, did not crush, did not even dent. The man in blue met his gaze at arm's length, expression unchanged, then drove a fist into Alucard's abdomen with focused, restrained violence. The blow folded Alucard in half. He was hurled downward like a fired shell, tearing a clean wound through the cloud layer and reappearing below as a falling star wrapped in blood and shadow. The city rushed back up to meet him. Alucard laughed on the way down, a sound that stretched thin with acceleration. He struck the river. Water exploded upward in a towering white plume, swallowing the sound of impact inside a titanic concussion. Shockwaves rippled outward, capsizing small craft, rattling bridge pylons, ripping mooring lines loose in snapping screams of fiber. The surface churned into violent chaos as something dark moved beneath it. A heartbeat later, the river erupted again. Alucard launched skyward from the water like a reborn projectile, steam and mist shearing off his regenerating form in wild streamers. Half his torso was still reassembling, organs knitting back into prescribed order even as he accelerated upward. The man in blue was already there. They collided again above the river in a flaring corona of displaced atmosphere. This time Alucard wrapped both arms around his enemy's torso and twisted, hurling them both sideways through the air in a savage arc. The pair slammed into the span of a bridge at hypersonic speed. Steel screamed. Support cables vaporized. A section of roadway collapsed as if bitten out by a god. They tumbled through falling debris in a storm of concrete slabs and sparking rebar. The man in blue broke free in mid-fall and arrested himself with controlled deceleration, hovering amid the ruin. Alucard struck the riverbank in an explosion of earth and stone, carving a deep trench through wet soil and shattered infrastructure before skidding to a stop, half buried. For a moment, only the wreckage moved. Then Alucard rose again. His regeneration was slowing, not failing, but shifting its cadence, as if the rules of this universe were negotiating with his existence instead of conceding to it. Muscle reformed in layered ripples. Skin followed with unnatural patience. He brushed mud from his shoulder and looked back up at the hovering figure with something new in his expression. Interest had matured into challenge. "All right," he said, voice quieter now, stripped of some of its theatrical excess. "You don't break, you don't bend, you don't die. I respect that, truly." Above him, the man in blue regarded him with unblinking steadiness. "You regenerate because you don't accept limits," he said. "But every system does eventually, even yours." Alucard's smile returned slowly. "Then I suppose we're finally discussing philosophy." They moved simultaneously. The exchange that followed tore the sky into fragments. Every strike was answered with equal intent. They crossed the river twice in blinding arcs of motion, shattered the remaining span of the bridge with cascading impacts, and drove one another through the upper floors of two disparate high-rises in fountains of atomized concrete and screaming steel. Fire bloomed wherever ruptured gas lines caught up to the violence. The city burned in small, furious answers all around them. Below, the Emerald Sentinel fought a different battle. Debris rained from the heavens in lethal avalanches. He caught what he could in layered lattices of green force, diverting slabs of falling architecture into the river in controlled detonations of displaced water. The bat moved through the chaos like a wraith, clearing evacuation paths, cutting through flame and panic with tireless precision. Every calculation he made assumed the worst was yet to come. Because in the sky, neither combatant was yielding. Alucard struck again and again, regeneration chasing destruction in a cycle so rapid it blurred into a single, endless motion. The man in blue adapted with chilling efficiency, each counterstrike more exact than the last, pressure building not from raw strength but from relentless control. For the first time since his arrival, Alucard felt himself being pushed, not in distance but in state. His next regeneration stuttered. It was subtle, a fraction of a second too slow, a heartbeat too long before flesh reclaimed its shape. He noticed it immediately, his laughter cut short in the back of his throat. The man in blue saw it too. They collided one final time at speed that bent visible spectrum into screaming halos. The impact cracked the night in half. The shockwave flattened what remained of the riverside district, pushing water into the streets and streets into the air. Alucard was driven straight down through saturated earth into the buried infrastructure below, vanishing into a collapsing crater that immediately flooded with black, churning water. The man in blue hovered above the sinking ruin, eyes locked on the dark torrent, waiting. Seconds passed. No laughter. No shadow eruption. No rising figure. Only the river reclaiming stolen space with patient, suffocating force. Below the surface, deep beneath ruptured pipes and crushed stone, Alucard drifted in spiraling darkness as pressure crushed in from all sides. His regeneration worked, but sluggishly now, fighting not fire but inertia, not damage but drowning. Endless water folded around him with a quiet, intimate violence. For the first time in centuries, he did not immediately rise. Far above, emergency lights smeared across floodwater like bleeding constellations. The Emerald Sentinel hovered lower, uncertain. The bat stood rigid at the torn edge of the riverbank, every instinct screaming that stillness did not mean absence. High overhead, the clouds began slowly to close. And deep below the city's wounded veins, Alucard smiled into the crushing dark as something unfamiliar tightened around his existence. Not defeat. Not yet. But pressure applied by a world that refused to yield to him completely. The night held its breath. And in that held breath, the shape of what was coming next began to form. Deep beneath the river, where ruptured conduits bled electricity into black water and buried tunnels groaned like dying animals, Alucard drifted in a slow, spiraling descent. The weight above him was no longer just water and stone. It was consequence. The city pressed down through layers of infrastructure and history, compressing him into a narrowing column of dark pressure that hissed against his regenerating skin. His body rebuilt itself stubbornly, eternally. But now it did so under the relentless handshake of a world that did not recognize his usual dominion over death. His eyes opened in the dark. No light reached him here, not the green judgment of the skyborn sentinel, not the cold watchfulness of the bat, not even the faint shimmer of the man in blue who had driven him into this wet grave. There was only the churning murk and the sound of his own body reforming against a crushing hold. Bones reknit with pained clicks, lungs reassembled, filling instantly with water that they could not process. The sensation was endlessly recursive: build, drown, destroy, rebuild. A paradox loop stitched from centuries of invincibility, colliding with an ecosystem that did not care. Alucard laughed softly into the water. The sound never traveled far. It dissolved into vibration and vanished. Even humor drowned here. Above him, far beyond the lightless crush, the river's surface boiled with emergency response. The man in blue hovered just above the floodline, listening with senses that pierced atmospheres and stone alike. His expression had not changed, but something measured and restless moved behind his eyes now. He could not hear laughter. He could not see shadow movement. The absence strained against his instinct like a held note that refused to resolve. "He's still there," the Emerald Sentinel said, descending to hover at his flank. His light reflected in fractured slabs of drifting roadway. "I can't explain how I know, but he hasn't stopped." The man in blue nodded once. "He hasn't surrendered." On the far bank, half obscured by smoke and spray, the bat stood with one boot at the water's edge, cape plastered wetly against his armor. His eyes tracked the currents for subtle disturbances that never came. Every part of his posture bristled with unspent contingency. "This isn't containment," he said. "It's a delay." Above them, the city reeled in layer upon layer of damage control. Emergency channels overloaded. Hospitals overflowed. Power grids rerouted around smoking gaps where neighborhoods had ceased to exist in clean shapes. And beneath it all, in rooms built without windows and lined with reinforced silence, other decisions were beginning to stir. Deep under a mountain far from Gotham's burning reflections, a council chamber glowed with sterile light. Screens painted impossible geometries of energy exchange across their glass surfaces, tracing the aerial battle in data and heat signatures reduced to obedient abstraction. The footage played without sound, a blur of shadow and impossible blue, impacts mapped in red vectors. Around the chamber sat men and women who had dedicated their entire lives to preparing for the unexplainable. One of them paused the footage. "That thing isn't extraterrestrial," she said quietly. "At least not in the conventional sense. Its regenerative pattern violates every known biological ceiling. It doesn't conserve mass. It doesn't conserve energy. It simply refuses loss." "Then what category are we using?" another asked. She exhaled. "Anomalous immortal entity, origin unknown, behavior predatory, intelligence high, psychological profile theatrical." Around the table, expressions tightened. "Is it hostile?" A different voice answered, calm and older. "It arrived violently. It has not chosen restraint. That is sufficient." Back in Gotham's drowned underworld, Alucard finally slowed his descent. Not because the pressure had lessened, because he had reached the bottom. The tunnel widened into a buried reservoir chamber, a cathedral of rusted pipes and ancient concrete, filled completely with black water that vibrated with residual electricity. The current pushed against him in lazy, grinding loops. Above, the ceiling was a cracked mosaic of infrastructure scars, faint rivulets of silt bleeding through like slow tears. Alucard touched down on the silt-choked floor in a bloom of upward drifting sediment. He stood there for several long seconds, water pressing in from all directions, crushing, invading, unyielding. His lungs reconstructed and failed again, over and over. But now, his regeneration was adapting not to trauma, but to environment. Tissue began to change its cadence. Blood thickened into something more patient. Shadow clung closer to muscle than before, reinforcing what flesh alone could not endure. The city was teaching him new rules. "Oh," he murmured into the black water, voice swallowed as it formed. "You are impressively stubborn." His shadow peeled away from him in slow, drifting ribbons and pressed against the chamber walls. It probed cracks, seams, pressure points worn thin by centuries of water and strain. The darkness behaved like a blind organism, learning the boundaries of its cage by touch alone. Above, the man in blue finally moved. He broke from his hover and plunged into the river without splash or hesitation, vanishing beneath the floodline in a silver blur. The Emerald Sentinel followed a breath later, green light shrinking quickly to a dim smear as it sank. On the bank, the bat did not follow. He watched the water close over them with rigid stillness, already mapping the damage spreading outward from this single vertical axis of catastrophe. Deep below, Alucard felt the approaching presences long before they reached him. The water changed its song. Pressure vectors shifted. Two disturbances cut clean paths toward him through the dark. One of them burned. The other carried the weight of a star that refused to fall. Alucard straightened in the black water as shadow recoiled into his body. His grin returned, slow and luminous even without light. "I was wondering when you'd come knock on the door properly," he thought into the void, unsure whether the words would ever leave him. The water began to glow green in expanding concentric rings. And above that glow, a familiar pressure folded upward through the depths with relentless certainty. The city had decided not to wait him out. It had decided to descend. The green light reached him first, blooming through the black like a living constellation. It crawled along broken pipes and fractured concrete, illuminating suspended debris and drifting silt in slow-motion halos. Alucard watched it advance with the calm of something that had stared down far worse than illumination. Light could be burned. Light could be bent. Light could lie. What concerned him was the other presence. The pressure arrived as a silence inside the water, a place where motion itself seemed to hesitate. Even before the familiar weight settled into the chamber, Alucard felt the displacement of inevitability. The man in blue did not announce himself with sound. He announced himself with absence. They saw each other through 30 meters of churning dark. The Emerald Sentinel descended more cautiously, green radiance, cocooning his form as he slowed above shattered pylons and dangling cables. The man in blue dropped with unhurried certainty, boots angling toward the silted floor where Alucard stood waiting. Shadow gathered tight around his frame like a second musculature. For a moment, none of them moved. Water pressed against them all with crushing intimacy. Ancient pipes groaned like dying lungs. Stray electrical arcs snapped and dissolved in distant shadows. The chamber felt less like a battlefield and more like a grave that had not yet decided who to keep. "You should have stayed down," the man in blue said, his voice carrying through the water not as sound, but as controlled vibration that Alucard's reconstructed senses translated into meaning. Alucard inclined his head slightly and missed the follow-up. The Emerald Sentinel extended one glowing hand. Energy lattices unfolded outward in tight, overlapping spirals, forming a containment geometry in 3 dimensions. "You're destabilizing this entire infrastructure zone," he said. "If this chamber collapses, the flood will take half the lower districts with it." Alucard glanced around as if only just now considering the architecture. "Ah, so now I'm a civic engineering problem. How flattering." The water surged. The man in blue moved. There was no warning strike this time. He covered the distance in a single compression of space and drove both fists into Alucard's chest with enough force to split the silt floor and fracture bedrock beneath it. The chamber shuddered violently. Pipes tore loose in shrieking arcs. Alucard's torso folded inward, ribs shattering into a cloud of pale fragments that scattered through the dark like thrown bones. The emerald light flared as containment fields snapped into place across the chamber walls. hardening concrete and iron into rigid, glowing frameworks that absorbed the spreading fractures before they could propagate. Alucard's body recoiled from the impact, half atomized, half collapsing inward. His head detached in the turbulence and drifted upward on a ribbon of black shadow, eyes still burning with delighted focus. "Oh no," his disembodied mouth said lightly, "you're learning." His form reassembled mid-water, shadow knitting first, flesh following like wet silk drawn over a blade. Even faster this time, even cleaner. The man in blue did not retreat. He advanced into the regeneration, hammering blow after blow into a structure that refused to stay broken. Each impact sent compression ripples through the chamber, each one caught and dispersed by the emerald frameworks before they could compromise the whole. For the first time, Alucard stopped laughing. Not from fear, from concentration. He slipped inside the timing. Between one strike and the next, between the moment where steel-locked musculature reset and forward momentum resolved, Alucard's shadow surged outward, not as a mass, but as vectors. Black lances pierced through the water with impossible speed, striking at joints, at internal leverage points, at the geometry of motion itself. One lance found the man in blue's shoulder. The impact jolted him sideways for the first time since their engagement began. The chamber shook. Alucard felt it immediately. Not damage, not injury, translation. Resistance that had finally produced displacement. His grin snapped back into place, sharp and reverent. "There we go," he whispered. The man in blue recovered in less than a breath, driving forward again. But now Alucard was no longer content to be driven. He met the advance head-on, shadow and flesh folding into each other as he struck with both substance and absence at once. The collision tore the water into collapsing vortices. Silt exploded outward in blinding spirals. The Emerald Sentinel strained to reinforce rapidly destabilizing containment grids. As sections of wall began to deform under stresses, they were never designed to endure. Deep, old cracks began to open above. Drips turned to streams, streams to roaring sheets. The chamber started to flood from dimensions it had not known it still had. Structural failure is approaching critical, the Emerald Sentinel warned as he expanded containment fields upward to compensate. We cannot maintain this indefinitely. The man in blue drove Alucard backward toward the center of the chamber with brutal efficiency, hurting rather than pursuing now, angling the conflict away from the weakening outer walls and toward the deepest point beneath the city. Alucard realized it a heartbeat too late. "Oh," he breathed, laughter returning quieter now. "You're not fighting me, you're repositioning me." The man in blue seized him by the throat and the back of the skull, and forced him straight down through the silt floor in a descending explosion of stone and ancient foundation. The Emerald Sentinel surged after them, green light spearing downward into the collapsing shaft, just as the chamber finally gave way behind them in a deafening cascade of roaring black water. They fell, deeper than Gotham's forgotten tunnels, deeper than any map, past crushed remnants of buried infrastructure into hollows that had not felt motion since before the city learned to call itself a city. Rock screamed as it tore. Water followed in devouring columns. Alucard struck bedrock and rebounded, spine pulverizing and reforming in the same unfinished motion. The man in blue landed moments later, anchoring himself with a shockwave that stabilized the immediate radius. The Emerald Sentinel arrived last in a bloom of green that hardened the collapsing shaft above them into a sealed, glowing conduit of frozen catastrophe. They stood now in a cavern far below the drowned district, airless, lightless except for emerald glow and distant sparks of severed conduction bleeding through ruptures in the rock. The city thundered far above them, muffled and immense. Alucard pushed himself upright slowly. His regeneration was still functioning, but now it pulsed instead of flowed. Something in this depth resisted him, crushed more than body, crushed narrative. "This," he said softly, surveying the sealed shaft above them, has officially escalated into commitment. The man in blue did not respond with words. He stepped forward with finality. And far above them, beyond layers of collapsing stone and frightened earth, instruments in buried facilities spiked violently as unknown energy signatures multiplied in impossible ways, as if something beneath Gotham had begun to wake up. The cavern trembled with the aftershock of their descent, stone groaning as if the planet itself were trying to remember how to be whole. Dust drifted in slow, suffocating curtains through the emerald light, each drifting particle a relic of something that had once sworn permanence. Alucard straightened amid the settling debris, boots crunching over crushed rock that had not seen open air in geological ages. Water bled through fractured seams high above, threading downward in thin, glittering veins that evaporated against green containment fields before they could gather into another drowning. The man in blue stood opposite him in the emerald glow, posture unbroken, eyes steady as a held horizon. No cape stirred here. There was no wind, only pressure, only depth. Alucard rolled his shoulders once, vertebrae reasserting alignment with a sound like distant artillery being packed back into its cradle. His regeneration still worked, but now it worked like something hauling itself up from mud rather than gliding through air. "You brought me somewhere private," Alucard said, glancing at the sealed shaft above them. "Dinner and a show next." "Here," the man in blue replied, "there's no one for you to leverage, no city to threaten, no civilians to hide behind, just what you can endure." Alucard smiled slowly. "Careful, that's always been my strongest subject." They moved at the same time. No theatrics now. No warning flecks of shadow or flare of explosive acceleration. Pure convergence. Their collision punched a concave dent into the cavern floor, bedrock buckling like heated wax beneath the focused violence of two opposing absolutes. Alucard struck with shadow-threaded blows that bent angles where no movement should exist. The man in blue answered with controlled exposure of strength that refused to escalate beyond what was necessary to dominate. The exchange became brutal in its restraint. Every strike mattered now. Every fraction of timing carried consequence. Alucard felt it in the way his regeneration strained to keep pace with impact cadence instead of outpacing it. Shadow retracted faster. Flesh took longer to remember what it had been a breath before. He was being forced into sequence. For the first time since his arrival in this universe, Alucard was no longer playing ahead of the clock. He was being synchronized with it. The man in blue drove a fist into Alucard's abdomen with such concentrated force that the surrounding air collapsed inward, forming a vacuum snap that tore silt and stone into the impact zone. Alucard's torso inverted violently, organs displaced into shadow as his spine bowed in a direction it did not normally acknowledge. He was hurled backward into a natural stone column that exploded around his body into 1,000 screaming shards. He did not rise immediately. The Emerald Sentinel hovered at the edge of the chamber, hands raised, maintaining structural bindings as new fracture lines spidered outward from the repeated impacts. The rock was old. It remembered pressure, but it had not been asked to remember gods. "You will destabilize the subplate if this continues," the Sentinel warned. "There are failure points extending far beyond Gotham's foundation." The man in blue did not turn his head, then hold it. The emerald light intensified along the chamber's outer curves, latticework deepening from glow into something approaching solidity. The cavern stopped actively collapsing, but the strain written into every green filament was unmistakable. From the settling rubble, Alucard laughed. It was quieter than before, thicker. He rose slowly from the wreckage, shadow pulling stone from his body in grinding ribbons. His regeneration stuttered again, catching on something unseen before smoothing out with visible effort. A dark fissure remained across his chest for a moment longer than it should have before closing. "Ah," he said thoughtfully, "there it is." The man in blue advanced again at once, but this time Alucard did not meet him head-on. He vanished sideways, sliding not through space, but along it, a lateral displacement that dragged shadow across the cavern wall like spilled ink. He reappeared behind the man in blue in the same breath, both hands already locking around his opponent's shoulders as he drove them forward into the emerald-lit containment lattice. The impact sent a destabilizing surge through the green framework. The Sentinel grimaced as feedback rippled through his constructs. The rock behind the lattice bowed inward like a flexed ribcage. Alucard pressed in close, face near the man in blue's ear, voice a low murmur of delighted strain. "You feel it, don't you? This world's rules are pressing back against both of us now. The difference is, I break rules for a living." The man in blue broke free with a violent torsion of his upper body, twisting out of Alucard's grip by brute mechanical inevitability. He seized Alucard by the collar and drove him straight upward into the cavern's ceiling with a concussion that cracked the stone dome open in a widening starburst pattern. Dust and rubble cascaded down in a roaring veil. They traded places in dominance with unnatural speed, one driving, the other refusing to stay driven. Each time Alucard struck now, it carried subtle adaptation. Shadow no longer merely pierced or bludgeoned. It sought torque. It sought pivot. It tried to force leverage into a contest of pure mass and will. And the man in blue answered every attempt. Not with escalation, with constraint refined to surgical cruelty. He seized Alucard mid-lunge, redirected his shadow-limbed strike into the cavern wall, and drove a palm into the base of Alucard's skull with enough focused force to momentarily shut down both coordination and regeneration simultaneously. For a split heartbeat, one impossible, dangerous heartbeat, Alucard went still in his hands. Not unconscious. Interrupted. The Emerald Sentinel inhaled sharply. That window. But the man in blue did not capitalize with annihilation. He held. He leaned closer and spoke with a quiet that cut deeper than any blow. "You regenerate because you reject endings, but this world carries limits whether you accept them or not. You are not above consequence here." Alucard's eyes flared back to life even as shadow twitched uncertainly along his frozen limbs. "No," he replied softly, "but I am very good at discovering how much consequence a world can survive." His shadow surged explosively outward in a radial detonation that tore the man in blue free and hurled both of them across the cavern in opposite arcs. They struck opposing walls with titanic force, rebounded, and crashed back into the chamber's center in another blinding convergence of impulse. The floor split. A chasm opened beneath them with a sound too deep to be properly called noise. Something ancient, vast, and hollow answered from below with a subterranean resonance that vibrated through both combatants' bones. The Emerald Sentinel's eyes widened. That's not a natural void. From the depths of the new fracture, a pressure began to rise that did not belong to rock, water, or air. Alucard felt it first as a tightening behind his smile. "Oh," he whispered. "Not fear. Recognition." The cavern continued to split, as if something beneath it were drawing breath. The fracture beneath Gotham was not merely a wound in stone. It was a breath, a slow, ancient inhalation rising from a depth that had never learned the meaning of sky. The pressure rolling out of it was not heat, not cold, not wind, but presence. And the first thing that presence touched was Alucard's shadow. His laughter stopped. Only for a heartbeat. But in that dangerous fraction of time, his shadow stiffened around him, drawing tight as if something below had recognized him in return. Alucard turned his head slowly toward the widening darkness, red eyes narrowing as the light from above bent strangely around the edges of the abyss. Down there was no color, no depth that the mind could measure, only a sensation he had once known in another universe long buried beneath memory. Not a hunter. A judge. The emerald light shuddered. The green sentinel reinforced his constructs instinctively, lines of glowing geometry thickening under the sudden strain. That thing is alive, he said quietly. This is not geological, it's waking up. The man in blue did not take his eyes off the fracture. For the first time, something like recalculation moved through his stillness. Not fear, adjustment. It belongs to this planet, he said, but it does not belong to this city. Alucard's lips curled upward again, slow and deliberate. Your city keeps very interesting secrets in its basement. From THE Chinese letter below, the first shape emerged, not fully a form, not yet an object. It was a pillar of absence, dragging darkness inward rather than casting it outward. Stone around it softened and crumbled, not from heat, but from meaning being stripped away. Reality itself hesitated there, as if unsure what rules still applied. The green sentinel fell back a half step, rapidly weaving new containment layers. I can't imprison it, he said, only redirect it. Then redirect it, the man in blue replied. It cannot reach the surface. From the depths came a second pulse of pressure. This one did not shove at space alone. It pushed at intent. Alucard slid back a few centimeters across broken stone. Only a few. But in that cavern, it felt like thunder. Alucard laughed again, but now something new threaded through the sound. All right, he said softly. This is no longer just a personal disagreement between me and your skyline. He stepped toward the fracture. Stop, the man in blue ordered. Alucard did not stop. With each step, his shadow thickened, layering over his body like living armor. You press me, he said calmly. This thing calls to me, which means it recognizes me. The green sentinel flared outward in a burst of emerald force, trying to shove Alucard laterally. His construct sank halfway into Alucard's shadow before freezing, caught in unseen jaws. The man in blue moved instantly. This strike was different from the rest. Not explosive, not theatrical. It was pure annihilating intention, compressed into a single, perfect vector. His fist drove straight into the center of Alucard's chest. There was no sound, only collapse. Alucard's torso folded inward, shadow rupturing instead of blooming. For the first time since his arrival in this universe, his regeneration failed to answer immediately. He was launched backward and slammed into the very edge of the abyss, half his body hanging over infinite dark. Below him, the fracture expanded as if inhaling. The green sentinel's voice shook. It's pulling him. Alucard looked down into the void and smiled. Not with humor this time, with recognition. And far beneath them, something vast shifted in the deep foundations of the world and turned its attention fully upward for the first time in ages. The cavern trembled. The city above shuddered. And the war beneath Gotham officially began. The pull intensified. It was not gravity. It was not suction. It was intent made directional, a will translated into downward pressure. Alucard's body slid another inch toward the abyss despite the fractured stone biting into his boots. Shadow lashed outward instinctively, anchoring itself to the cavern walls in a forest of black tendrils that strained and trembled like overburdened cables. The fissure below him brightened, not with light, but with absence deepening into something that resembled focus. The man in blue seized Alucard by the collar and hauled him back from the edge in a single brutal motion. Stone tore free where Alucard's shadow had rooted itself, entire slabs shearing off and vanishing into the dark with no echo of impact. The abyss did not return sound. It consumed it. For the first time since his arrival in this universe, Alucard did not laugh when dragged. The emerald sentinel expanded outward in a radiant surge, a dome of green geometry unfolding to brace the collapsing cavern. The strain was immediate. His constructs flickered under pressures they were never designed to mediate, pressures that did not push but erase tolerance. It's not just moving up, he warned. It's revising the local reality gradient. We're standing in a fault between what is and what it wants to be. The cavern answered with a sound, like a continent shifting in its sleep. From the fracture, something rose. It did not emerge upward in the way creatures did. It unfolded into the space above itself, as if the void had decided to occupy volume. A vast, indistinct silhouette took form within distortions of pressure and absence, larger than the chamber could logically contain. Rock around it fractured with delayed confusion, as though matter itself required time to agree that it had been displaced. Alucard stared at it with an expression that hovered between fascination and reverence. "You're not a god," he whispered. "You're a remainder." The thing did not speak. Its presence did. The pressure slammed outward in a radial wave that annihilated what remained of the cavern's natural geometry. Emerald constructs flared violently as the sentinel poured everything he had into containment. The man in blue was hurled backward through solid stone into a buried pocket of open space that detonated into a cloud of powdered rock. Alucard was ripped from his anchor points and flung across the chamber in a spiral of shadow and shattered debris, slamming into the far wall with enough force to crater it inward. For a fraction of a second, all three of them were disoriented. The entity stabilized first. Whatever it was not bound by the same delays. Its outline sharpened, not into a defined body but into a decision. It leaned upward. The fracture widened. Above, miles of Gotham's forgotten understructure groaned in chorus as stresses began to propagate toward the surface. The Emerald Sentinel hovered with visible effort, emerald light stuttering at the edges. If it crests the mid-foundation layers, the city won't absorb the displacement, he said. It will translate it. Entire districts gone. The man in blue reappeared in a thunder crack, instant repositioning placing him between the rising entity and the vertical axis toward the city above. He braced both hands forward, feet sinking into bedrock as he pushed against a mass that did not have mass, but carried consequence instead. For the first time, he grunted with effort. Alucard pushed himself out of the wall, regeneration now visibly laboring. Shadow flowed more slowly, reshaping itself with grudging persistence rather than indulgent speed. He tilted his head, eyes locked on the impossibility rising from below. "You're the reason this world doesn't understand its own dark," he said. "Buried mistake, forgotten sentence." The entity's pressure pivoted. Not toward the city. Toward him. The pull on Alucard intensified violently. Shadow tore loose from the cavern walls in snapping arcs. His boots lost purchase. He slid backward toward the widening fracture, shadow wrapping tighter and tighter around his form as if trying to crush him inward for protection. The man in blue looked back at him sharply. "Get out of its path." Alucard's grin returned thin, sharp, and feral. "I think," he replied, "I'm exactly in it." For the first time since entering this universe, Alucard did something unexpected. He stopped resisting the pull. His shadow recoiled fully into his body, condensing, compressing, drawing inward as if collapsing into a singular core. His fall accelerated instantly as the entity's pressure seized full control of his mass and intent. He plunged straight toward the heart of the rising void like a sacrificial projectile. "Alucard," the Emerald Sentinel began. Too late. Alucard vanished into the distortion. The chamber convulsed. Pressure spiked so violently that the emerald constructs shattered in cascading green fractures, each breaking layer detonating into raw luminous discharge. The man in blue was hurled backward again, carving a tunnel through ancient stone before arresting himself in a shockwave that rippled outward like a detonated horizon. Inside the distortion, something changed. The entity recoiled, not in pain, not in fear, but in disruption. For the first time since its emergence, its ascent stuttered. The pressure oscillated erratically. The fractures widening slowed, then halted. Then sound returned. A low, thick vibration rolled upward from the depths, not as speech, but as resistance being answered from within. Shadow erupted from the distortion in writhing, screaming arcs, as if a universe of blackened veins had suddenly found arteries to escape through. And through that storm of living darkness, Alucard's silhouette reformed. He did not rise cleanly. His body reassembled in violent, unstable layers, shadow over bone, bone over muscle, muscle over something that did not yet remember how to be flesh. His eyes ignited last, blazing red through the crawling dark as he dragged himself upward out of the entity's core like a wound learning how to bleed. His laughter returned in full, but now it was altered, strained, triumphant and angrier than before. "Oh," he gasped between ruptured breaths that rebuilt themselves mid-sound, "you do bite back." The entity surged again, but now its ascent was no longer uninterrupted. Every movement upward was answered by shadow-driven resistance tearing through its absence like hooks through fog. The two impossibilities locked together beneath the earth, not in combat as the city understood it, but in something closer to mutual erasure. The man in blue advanced once more, eyes burning with a new intensity as he launched himself back into the collapsing frontline between rising void and regenerating monster. "This ends now," he said, and meant not just Alucard. Far above them, in chambers shielded behind layers of secrecy and failsafe stone, instruments screamed as containment tolerances across the planet's deepest geological fault lines spiked in synchrony. Gotham was no longer the center of the event. It was merely the first place losing the argument. And beneath it, in the grinding dark where forgotten things learned to wake again, Alucard smiled through torn flesh and rising catastrophe, certain of only one truth. This world had finally given him something that could fight back. The dark beneath Gotham had ceased to behave like a place. It was no longer a cavern, no longer a fracture, no longer even a boundary between solid and void. It had become a condition, an argument between existence and erasure that neither side could fully win. Alucard and the ancient remainder were locked together at the center of that argument, shadow and absence tearing into one another in spirals that bent perception into nauseating curves. Every time the entity attempted to rise, Alucard's shadow wrapped around it in constricting bands of living negation. Every time he tightened his hold, the void answered by thinning reality around his grip, until even his concept of resistance began to blur. Above them, the man in blue tore through collapsing stone and plunging darkness once more, emerald light flaring behind him as the sentinel followed at maximum output. The descent was no longer measured. They were falling through a battlefield that reconfigured itself with every heartbeat. The man in blue reached Alucard first. He struck him sideways out of the entity's direct influence, with a collision that shattered a floating ring of compressed rock into vapor. Alucard tumbled through blackened space and slammed into the wall of a forming void pocket, shadow splintering outward like broken ribs before snapping back into him. "Enough," the man in blue said, gripping Alucard by the throat and holding him suspended against writhing nothing. "You don't understand what you're connected to." Alucard coughed once as his windpipe reconstructed inside the grip. Even now, he smiled. "No," he admitted evenly, "but I understand you, and you're terrified of it." The Emerald Sentinel hovered above them, constructs fanning out in desperate containment layers as the entity's pressure began folding space in unpredictable tides. "He's not wrong," the Sentinel said tightly. "This thing predates your biosphere. It prefigures your tectonics. It's not invading, it's remembering." The void surged. A colossal limb-like distortion swept through the dark and annihilated 3 layers of emerald construct in a single pass. The feedback hurled the Sentinel backward in a storm of fractured light. Only rapid recalibration kept him from being ripped into the entity's gravity well. The man in blue released Alucard and drove himself straight into the advancing distortion with both arms extended, pushing against something that could not be pushed in any conventional sense. The shockwave of that resistance tore a temporary corridor of stability through the surrounding chaos. Alucard watched him do it. For the first time, the vampire did not feel amusement. He felt memory. Not this moment, but 1,000 others across dead worlds, burning castles, fallen heavens. Always the same pattern. A being that claimed the future by force of will alone. A being that refused to retreat even when the universe itself protested. "You're repeating yourself," Alucard murmured to no one. The entity twisted its pressure vector suddenly, slamming the corridor shut and forcing the man in blue back across 100 meters of collapsing void. The Emerald Sentinel surged in to replace him, green light blazing as he wove an overlapping containment ellipses at impossible speed. "I cannot outlast this," the Sentinel warned. "Its scale exceeds this system. It is anchoring through him." His gaze flicked to Alucard. "Through you." Alucard's shadow rippled uneasily. For the first time since his awakening, he felt the entity not merely pulling at him but mapping him. His regeneration stuttered again. The lag was still fractions of a second, but now those fractions were stacking. Something in the void was learning his rhythm. "Oh," he whispered, "you're adapting." The man in blue returned in a sonic detonation, ramming straight into the entity's pressure front and splitting it like an ocean wave around an unbreakable prow. He seized Alucard again, hauling him out of the lethal center of distortion and slamming him into a stabilizing pocket of air created by emerald reinforcement. "You're not bait," he said. "You're a breach." Alucard tilted his head. "I've been called worse things." But beneath the dry cadence, something else flickered, recognition, not of weakness but of positioning. For the first time, he understood the truth of the dynamic. The entity was not rising because it wanted the city. It was rising because it wanted him. Or rather, what he represented, a contradiction to extinction. Its pressure was no longer random. It was hunting his refusal. The Emerald Sentinel's voice dropped. "If it integrates his regenerative principle into its ascension pattern, we will lose any meaningful concept of containment. It will not simply rise, it will persist." The void surged again, stronger than before. This time its pressure did not aim at ascent. It aimed at assimilation. Shadow and absence collided in a violent implosion that folded space inward like a collapsing lung. Alucard was dragged half a body length toward the entity again, shadow flaring and tearing as it fought to keep him coherent. The man in blue wrapped both arms around Alucard's torso and anchored himself with titanic force against bedrock that ceased pretending to be solid. "Then we end this now," he growled. "Together or not at all." Alucard looked at him sideways, eye burning. "You really don't negotiate with monsters, do you?" "I don't let them decide the future." For a long, impossible second, they held there, two impossibilities locked against a third that should not exist at all. Shadow screamed. Emerald light fractured and reforged. The void pressed closer and closer, its structure stabilizing around Alucard's regenerative signature like a parasite learning its host. And in that suffocating compression, something finally cracked inside Alucard. Not bone. Not shadow. Perspective. He stopped resisting. Not the void, but the pattern. His shadow collapsed inward once more, not into offense, not into defense, but into absolute compression. He forced his regenerative loop to tighten past comfort, past instinct, past even the idea of continuity. For the first time in his existence, he did not allow his body to complete its own recovery cycle. The void hesitated. The entity's pressure faltered, not from damage but from confusion. Assimilation requires continuity. Alucard had just broken his own. The man in blue felt the shift instantly. He looked at Alucard in shock. "What are you doing?" Alucard's grin was gone. In its place was something older, colder. "I'm changing the rules it's learning from," he said. The void recoiled, and for the first time since it woke, it made something close to a sound. Not a roar, a rupture. The foundations of Gotham screamed in answer. The rupture did not bloom outward. It folded inward. For an instant that did not belong to time, the void compressed itself around the fracture it had carved into reality, pulling its own pressure into a sudden, implosive silence. Emerald light buckled. Shadow collapsed. Even the man in blue was dragged a half-step forward, as if the universe itself had briefly forgotten which direction resistance was supposed to face. Then the sound came. Not an explosion. A scream made of stone, absence and broken causality. The cavern inverted. What had been floor became wall. What had been distance became proximity. The entity recoiled into itself as Alucard's deliberately corrupted regeneration cycle tore through its structural logic like a contagion of contradiction. It had attempted to integrate his refusal to end, and instead ingested a refusal to continue. The first true wound opened in the void. It manifested as a distortion of distortion, a ragged tear in nothing that bled pressure outward in unstable pulses. The entity's ascent shuddered, then stalled completely as its internal coherence fractured under competing imperatives. Rise, assimilate, stabilize, persist. It could not satisfy all four simultaneously. The man in blue seized the moment without hesitation. He drove forward with controlled, limitless force, each strike now aimed not at mass, but at the fault lines Alucard had forced into existence. Every blow landed with surgical precision against newly exposed weaknesses in the void's distorted geometry. Pressure collapsed inward. The tear widened. Emerald constructs surged back into relevance as the Sentinel poured everything he had into reinforcing those growing instabilities. Green lattices pinned pieces of the tearing absence in place like spiritual rebar, driven through a collapsing god. But Alucard was losing cohesion. His body flickered, not between human and shadow, between states. One heartbeat he was solid, fangs bared, eyes burning. The next he was half idea, half absence, a silhouette lagging behind its own motion like a misaligned echo. His regeneration no longer flowed. It stuttered in jagged restarts, each recovery leaving him less certain of the outline he was returning to. The void had stopped learning from him. Now it was rewriting him. The man in blue felt it through the contact of the environment itself, through stresses that no longer propagated cleanly. He turned sharply toward Alucard. "You're burning yourself out of continuity," he said. "Whatever you're doing, you won't come back from it." Alucard laughed weakly, blood drifting upward in slow, glittering spirals. "You say that," he replied, "as if that hasn't been the thesis of my entire existence." A new surge tore through the cavern. Not upward, inward. The entity tried to collapse around Alucard directly, attempting to forcibly stabilize by consuming the corrupted data source at its center. The pull intensified to catastrophic levels. Emerald constructs screamed as their energy budgets spiked beyond rational containment tolerances. The man in blue anchored himself against bedrock that had begun to liquefy under conceptual strain and wrapped both arms around Alucard again. For the first time, he pulled away. Shadow tore loose from Alucard's back like ligaments snapping from bone. The void answered with a violent recoil, offended by the denied capture. Entire sections of the cavern collapsed into the tear and vanished without sound. The Sentinel hovered above them, voice strained to its algorithmic limits. "The system is approaching runaway recursion. If the void stabilizes around either of you, it will propagate outward through the fault network. This will not remain a Gotham event." The man in blue understood immediately. Alucard did too. Their eyes met across a storm of shadow, emerald fire, and devouring nothing. "You want to throw me in," Alucard said softly. "You're the anchor it wants," the man in blue replied. "If it completes integration, it won't stop rising. If it consumes the corrupted cycle as is, it'll collapse itself," Alucard finished, "or tear a new rule into the universe trying. Either way," the Sentinel added, "the probability that this planet survives the second outcome is low." Alucard went very still. His flaring shadows settled into a slow, heavy coil around his form. His regeneration attempted one more full reconstruction and failed halfway through, leaving a dark, unfinished seam across his chest that refused to close. For the first time since arriving in this world, his grin did not return. "So," he murmured, "you finally found something that eats monsters." The void surged again, closer now than ever, its pressure curling around him like the gravitational horizon of a waiting singularity. The man in blue tightened his grip. "You don't get to decide this alone." Alucard looked at his hands, at shadows struggling to remember its boundaries. "That's the problem with your kind," he said quietly. "You think sacrifice is special." He leaned forward into the pull before the man in blue could re-anchor him. Shadow and flesh tore free simultaneously. The force ripped him out of the hero's grip in a violent spiral and flung him straight into the heart of the void's collapsing structure. The moment Alucard crossed the threshold, the entity convulsed as if it had finally swallowed a paradox it could not digest. The green sentinel cried out as containment fields spiked into unstable overload. Event horizon forming now. The tear folded shut around Alucard like a clenched fist. Inside the collapsing distortion, the last thing Alucard felt was not pain. It was recognition. The void did not erase him. It attempted to become like him. And that was its final error. From within the sealed fracture, a blinding shock of inverted pressure tore outward. The entire cavern detonated in a ring of green, black, and impossible absence, as the void's internal logic imploded under mutually exclusive imperatives. The man in blue was hurled backward through solid stone and into buried infrastructure far above, carving a molten tunnel through ancient layers of Gotham. The Emerald Sentinel was flung violently upward, barely holding himself together as shattered constructs rained around him like dying stars. Below them, the fracture collapsed completely. The void vanished. The pressure ceased. The deep fell silent. For a long time, nothing moved beneath Gotham. Only settling stone. Only cooling light. Only the fatting echo of a monster who had finally found something that could not decide whether to end him or inherit him. And far above, on the surface of the city that would never fully understand what had just spared it, emergency lights flickered uncertainly as the ground stopped shaking. Alucard did not come back. Not immediately. And that absence was louder than any of his laughter had ever been. The silence beneath Gotham lasted too long to be natural. Stone finished settling. Water found new resting lines in fractured veins of earth. The emerald light faded from blinding to dim, then from dim to a weak, trembling glow as the sentinel stabilized his own form and drifted upward through the scarred layers of buried infrastructure. He emerged into a cavern that had become a ruin of itself, collapsed pillars, vitrified rock, and at the center of it all, a smooth, sealed basin where the void had been. Where Alucard had been. The man in blue rose from the vertical shaft he had carved in his uncontrolled ascent, hovering amid drifting dust as his eyes swept across the devastation. His hearing strained into the deep silence below the silence, searching not for sound, but for continuity. There was nothing. No shadow perimeter. No regenerative echo. No predatory pressure pressing back against the world. Only absence. The Emerald Sentinel's voice was quieter than algorithms preferred to be. The anomaly signature has ceased. There is no residual recursion. Whatever happened inside that collapse resolved itself. The man in blue did not answer immediately. He looked down at the sealed basin where impossible pressure had once tried to rewrite the future, and for the first time since the night began, his posture slackened by the smallest measurable degree. Far above them, Gotham exhaled. The city did not know why the earthquakes had stopped. It did not know why the river suddenly stilled, why collapsing districts only half collapsed, why emergency channels fell quiet between breaths. It simply knew that something dreadful had passed without fully arriving. Streets remained flooded. Buildings lay broken. Power flickered in wounded rhythms, but the sky did not split again. On a ruined rooftop miles away, the Bat stood unmoving, cape resting like a torn flag against his back. His optics tracked the skyline where the green glow had finally dimmed to nothing. The rhythm of the city returned, ragged, stunned, but alive. A delay, he murmured into the darkness, or a burial. Neither answer satisfied him. Deep beneath the city, recovery operations began without ceremony. Drills bit into broken stone. Sensor arrays swept softened fault lines. Teams in sealed exosuits descended where even rats would not risk burrowing. They found ruptured conduits, hardened emerald residue, strange vitrified surfaces where pressure had folded time sideways. They did not find a body. They did not find remains. They did not even find shadow. Days passed. Then weeks. Gotham rebuilt in its usual lopsided way, scaffolding rising against broken skylines, emergency funding moving faster than morning, the city's trauma stitched over with daylight and denial. Official explanations ranged from freak seismic event to buried munitions depot collapse to eco-terror sabotage. None of them survived serious scrutiny. All of them survived the news cycle. But in places where the light thinned, rooftops at 3 in the morning, bridges under fog-heavy dawns, alleys where the city's memory never quite faded, rumors crept. Something had laughed beneath the world. The man in blue remained in the city longer than he usually would have. He listened to every tremor, every anomalous fluctuation, every whisper of displaced pressure in the deep geology below the streets. He watched the river at night, eyes tracing the places where water had once inverted against impossible force. The Emerald Sentinel departed reluctantly, his parting words unresolved. If that entity truly assimilated his contradiction, he said, it may not have erased him. It may have stalled him, preserved him in an unresolved state. You're saying he's still alive, the man in blue replied. I'm saying, the Sentinel answered carefully, that the universe currently cannot finish the equation. The Bat was the last to abandon the hunt. He returned to the destroyed districts night after night, studying blast geometries, residual stress fractures, impossible cuts through infrastructure that no known mechanism could fully account for. In every pattern, he searched not for the void, but for the signature of refusal that Alucard had carried like a curse and a crown. And then one night, the city twitched. It was small, barely measurable, a pressure ripple beneath the narrows that lasted less than half a second, too short for sensors to triangulate cleanly, too subtle for satellites to care. But it was enough. Deep below the riverbed, in the sealed basin, where the void had folded in on itself, a single fracture line glowed briefly with dim crimson light. Inside that light, something laughed. Not loudly, not triumphantly, just familiarly. And far above, on 3 separate rooftops across Gotham's skyline, 3 beings who had once held the fate of the city with their hands felt the same impossible thing at the exact same moment. A contradiction. Still breathing. The ground stilled again. The glow vanished. But the night did not return to normal, because something that had once been eaten had just learned how to wait. The second tremor came without warning. No seismic precursor, no harmonic echo through bedrock, just a sudden, intimate shiver beneath the narrows that felt less like the movement of earth and more like the flexing of a muscle that had been asleep too long. 3 people noticed it at once. 3 sets of eyes turned toward the same invisible depth. The city did not scream this time. It listened. Deep beneath the river, inside the sealed basin where absence had devoured itself, the crimson fracture reopened, not as a violent wound but as a deliberate incision. Rock parted with a sound like slow tearing cloth. Shadows seeped through first, thick and patient, spreading across vitrified stone in deliberate, searching tendrils. Then a hand emerged. The fingers were incomplete at first, half-formed between anatomy and idea, knuckle lines sketching themselves into being as if remembered rather than rebuilt. The hand curled, testing gravity, testing reality, drawing purchase. A shoulder followed, then a torso that stuttered between states for several heartbeats before locking into coherence with a sound like distant thunder settling into bone. Blood followed last, flowing backward into veins as if time itself had reversed its opinion. Alucard dragged himself free of the fracture and stood. He was different. The grin returned, but it was tighter now, less indulgent. The shadow at his feet did not sprawl with theatrical hunger. It coiled with discipline, hugging his outline like a second, more cautious skin. Across his chest, the old wound left by the void had not vanished. It remained as a dark seam that refused full closure, a reminder stitched into his immortality that some contradictions could scar even him. He took one slow breath. The river did not try to drown him this time. Far above, on a rain-slick rooftop, the bat lowered his optics by a fraction. He's back. Across the city, the man in blue straightened in midair as the pressure signature registered through senses trained to feel stellar birth from planetary distance. His voice carried through the night with quiet certainty, not as he was. On the far edge of atmosphere streaked with starlight, emerald eyes flared briefly before dimming again. The equation didn't resolve, the sentinel whispered to himself. It rebalanced. Alucard stepped forward out of the basin. Each footfall left no crater now, no defiance of mass, just the sound of boots on stone. The city no longer bent around him by default. For the first time since his creation, this world insisted on being acknowledged. "That's new," he said softly. Shadow answered with a quiet ripple. He ascended through the old wounds in the earth not as an invasion but as a return. Collapsed tunnels parted where his presence slid past them. Water drew away instead of resisting. It took time. Long seconds where once there would have been instant violation of distance. Above him, the city waited without knowing it was waiting. When Alucard finally emerged at the river's edge, dawn was beginning to thin the sky. Gotham looked wounded in daylight. The broken districts were no longer theatrical silhouettes but honest scars, collapsed housing, twisted bridges, streets still choked with drying silt. Emergency crews moved through the wreckage with careful human persistence, life pressing forward because it could do nothing else. Alucard watched them in silence. For the first time, he did not smell fresh war. No immediate invitation to massacre, just the slow, stubborn pulse of recovery. "A city that survives monsters," he murmured. "How irritatingly noble." "You could test that theory again." The voice came from behind him. Alucard turned. The bat stood on the ruined embankment a short distance away, posture unchanged from the night of their first meeting. He did not raise a weapon. He did not retreat. He simply existed in the space between threat and verdict. Alucard studied him for a long moment, eyes tracing the damage patched into the armor, the micro-fractures repaired but still visible if one knew where to look. "You kept the city breathing while we were busy arguing with the basement," he said. "I'll give you that." "You destabilized half the planet's fault network," the bat replied. Whatever you brought back with you didn't come back alone. Alucard's shadow tightened subtly. Oh, I came back alone, he said. That thing down there, it didn't survive the lesson, but it left me a reminder. Before the bat could respond, the air folded. The man in blue arrived without wind or thunder, just sudden, absolute presence. He hovered a meter above the fractured riverbank, eyes locked on Alucard with a gaze that had once driven him into the Earth's oldest hunger. You chose to return, he said. Alucard inclined his head just enough to mock politeness. Turns out the void has poor digestion. That tear in you, the man in blue continued, is still unstable. Whatever you corrupted down there, it's still rewriting parts of you. Alucard's grin flickered. Yes, I noticed, it's infuriating. For a long moment, none of them moved. The river flowed between them. Gotham breathed behind them. Then the man in blue descended, until his boots touched the broken concrete. You could leave this world, he said, right now, before your presence becomes another fault line. Alucard considered that, truly considered it. Once, the idea of departure would have been laughable. He had never left worlds because of consequence, only boredom. Now consequence stared back at him from within his own unhealed seam. And missed the sequel, he asked lightly. Then his voice dropped just enough to be honest. No, this city already survived me once. That makes it interesting. The bat shifted his stance a fraction. If you threaten it again. I know, Alucard replied. You'll growl, he'll punch, the sky will complain. The man in blue held his gaze. This is your only warning. Alucard tipped an imaginary hat. I do so treasure exclusivity. For a moment longer, the three of them stood at the thin edge of something that was no longer apocalypse, but was not peace either. Then the man in blue rose back into the sky, watching until distance softened the predator's outline. The bat melted into shadow without sound, returning to the city that would never stop asking him to choose it. Alucard was left alone with the river. He stepped back from the water's edge, shadow curling inward as dawn finally breached the skyline in full. The city did not recoil from him. It did not welcome him either. It simply endured. Alucard laughed quietly as he turned and walked into the waking streets. Not the old, unrestrained laughter of a god who could not be ended, but something narrower now, sharper, a predator adjusting to a world that had finally learned how to bite back. Above Gotham, the clouds parted. The city lived. The monster remained. And somewhere deep beneath everything, the void remembered him. Not as a meal, but as a scar. And